Over the first few weeks, we were looking at the first table of the law, those first 3 commandments, where God tells us how he expects us to act toward him. In this week, we're going to start looking at the second table of the law, the commandments 4 through 10, where God tells us how he expects us to act toward other people. Now, notice this deals with our relationship to other human beings. These commandments aren't about our relationship toward animals or plants or any other kinds of creatures. Specifically, they deal with how we're supposed to treat other people. And before we dive in, it's important to remember any sin against the second table is also a sin against the first table. If I sin against another person, I'm showing a lack of fear and love and trust for the God who made that other person and who made me to treat that other person a certain way. So bear that in mind as we begin looking at the fourth commandment, which deals with one of the most important relationships we can possibly have, namely the relationship between parents and children. Fourth commandment says, honor your father and your mother. What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not despise or anger our parents and other authorities, but honor them, serve and obey them, love and cherish them. So what is God commanding children to do in this commandment? First of all, he wants us to honor our parents. See, parents are God's representatives to their children. God gives them the task of providing for the needs of their children, making sure they're fed, they're clothed, they have a house. He also gives them the duty to make sure the children learn who God is, learn to honor and fear and love God. He gives parents the duty and the privilege of raising children to be people who live good lives and stay away from evil and harmful things. And because God gives our parents this sacred duty and this sacred responsibility and this great privilege, God commands children to look at their parents as though they really have that duty and that privilege from God and to respect them for it. And this goes along with the command to serve our parents. Yes, parents are put here by God to make sure that kids have what they need to live and grow, but that doesn't mean parents are here to answer the whims of their children. Instead, children should always look at their parents as the person of greater dignity. And so they should always put themselves at the service of their parents to make sure that their parents are well provided for, especially as they grow older, to make sure that their parents have what they need. And right along with that goes God's command that children should obey their parents. If your parents give instructions, they say what they expect, we should, as children, listen to them. Take what they say with absolute seriousness. Even as we grow older, even as we become adults, we should still listen very deeply and clearly to what our parents tell us and take any advice they offer as some of the most important advice to consider. And all of this should flow from a love for our parents. We are commanded to love and cherish them, to hold them as of extremely great value, as some of the most important and worthwhile people we will ever meet, who we devote ourselves to, because God himself has put them in our lives as people who we should devote ourselves to. All of this, whether we're talking honoring, serving, obeying, and loving, also goes with the other authorities God puts in our lives. Whether we're talking teachers at school or policemen or government officials, anyone who God has put into a position of authority over us, we should honor them as though God has given them that authority for the duties that he's given them. Now, of course, there are some exceptions to how far we should obey both authorities and parents, but we'll come to talk about that later. The good rule of thumb is honor, serve, obey, and love both parents and any other authority. But of course, this commandment isn't just for children. It also includes what parents are supposed to do and what God expects and requires parents to do as parents. In the most basic way, God expects parents to provide for the needs of their children so that they can be healthy and grow and mature. This includes the basics like food and shelter and clothing, anything that a child needs to live. But God, more than just making sure that children are able to get by, in fact, the most important task God gives to parents is to raise their children to fear and love and trust in God. Parents are required by God to make sure that children know who God is, what he's done, what he requires and commands, so that they learn to fear, to love, and to trust him above all things. Likewise, parents are supposed to provide discipline for their children to make sure and to do whatever the parents are able to do to make sure that their kids grow up with a good, solid character, that they grow up to be well-disciplined, respectful, and good people. This means that God does give parents the authority and the job of disciplining their children, which can include punishing children for disobeying or for bad behavior, and for rewarding good behavior in whatever form that looks like. And children should honor and respect their parents even while the parents are disciplining them. So if that's what God is commanding both children and parents, what is God forbidding children in the fourth commandment? What are they supposed to not do? Well, above all, they're supposed to not despise their parents. Remember, we saw the word despise when we were talking about the third commandment. Despise doesn't mean hate necessarily. It means, above all, that you don't take something seriously, that you think very little of it, that you don't think it's worth paying that much attention to. God is telling children they should not think little of their parents. And there's a lot of ways you can think little of your parents. You could overtly hate your parents. You could simply outrightly disobey your parents. That would be a way of despising them. You could simply refuse to serve them or take care of them as they get older. A common way, though, that we despise our parents is we'll do what they tell us to do, but we'll grumble, we'll complain about it, we'll dislike the fact that they asked us to do it, and we'll even dislike them. I'll go to my room and clean it when they tell me, but I'll spend most of the time also complaining and thinking about how much I can't wait till I get out from under their house and get to run things my way. All of those are ways of despising our parents. By the same token, God is saying we shouldn't anger our parents, which makes sense because if parents are doing their God-given tasks well, then they're only always commanding us to do things that we should be doing. The only way we would anger parents in that sense is if we were breaking the fourth commandment. The only reason they would have for being angry is if we were disobeying them, if we were disrespecting them, or if we were overtly trying to frustrate them. All of those things God forbids. And of course, just like what he commands, this also applies to other authorities, whether we're talking teachers or bosses or whatever. So if that's what God forbids children, what God forbids parents in the third commandment is, by the same token, exasperating, neglecting, or harming their children. What we mean by exasperating is by giving them unreasonable expectations or commands or forms of discipline that are simply unhelpful. Things that will have no result except make a child angry at their parents, dislike their parents, and disrespect their parents. So, for instance, simply setting rules to try to get a rise out of your kid and not out of a concern to make them better people would be exasperating your child. Neglecting children means failing to do the tasks that God has given you to do as a parent. So if you're obviously failing to feed your child, to properly clothe your child, to make sure your child is safe and healthy, that's a form of neglect everyone recognizes. But this also includes neglecting to inform your child about God, to educate them about what God has done for them, to bring them to church, to teach them the Bible. That's a very big form of neglecting your duty as a parent. Harming your children, overtly doing things that hurt your children, needless to say, completely goes against what God commands parents to do in the third commandment. Child abuse of any kind, whether it's physical, emotional, sexual, any kind, is absolutely forbidden in the third commandment. This also includes allowing children to go without discipline. Like we said, it means not teaching children to honor God. If you're not raising your child to know the difference between right and wrong and helping them choose the right, you're failing in your duty as a parent. So that summarizes the basic relationship of what parents are supposed to do and not supposed to do, and what children are supposed to do and not supposed to do. But it raises some important questions. A lot of them we can't talk about in detail here, but there are some very important ones that we should touch on. What if, for instance, my parents encourage or even command me to do something that goes against God's word? What if my parents are having financial trouble and so they encourage me to steal, for instance? In that case, if my parents tell me to do something I know is wrong, what I need to do is not listen to my parents. I listen to God rather than my parents. The same thing goes with other authorities. If my teacher, if the government, if the police tell me to do something that God says is wrong, we obey God instead of the person God sent to teach me how to follow him. Because then that person isn't teaching me how to follow God. They're teaching me to go against God. And I am duty bound to not obey them in that case. But what if my parents are abusive? What if they're neglecting me? What if they actively have harmed me or try to harm me? Well, in that case, we don't despise our parents. We don't hate them. What we're called to do by God is instead hold them accountable to the duties God has given them. In other words, we should honor our parents and the position God's given them enough that we expect them to stop doing the things God forbids. And we'll even make sure that we go to the other authorities that God has put in place, like police or governors or teachers, and report what my parents have been doing to me to hurt and harm me, so that the government and the police and the teachers can hold the parents accountable to the law that God has given them, and make sure that they're unable to abuse us in the future. What if my parents have not done their duty in raising me properly? So suppose my parents never really taught me much about God, or they taught me very bad behaviors, and I just never had the opportunity because of my parents to understand what was right and what was wrong. If my parents have not done their duty, one thing is important. Again, hold them accountable for what they failed to do. Show them their sin so that they might learn to confess what they've done wrong, change their ways, and receive forgiveness both from you and from God. But it also means you shouldn't blame, but we can't blame our parents for our own bad behavior. Even if our parents failed to show us what was right and what was wrong, that doesn't mean God's commandments to us don't apply anymore. We can't simply blame, for instance, I can't blame my parents if I end up in life in jail. Even though my parents may have not done their duty and they are blameworthy for failing to do their duty, it's my own fault that I ended up in jail, not my parents' fault. Regardless of whether I have good and faithful parents or bad parents who have broken God's law, I always need to honor them, not despise them, and hold them up as the representatives God has given me, to thank God for them, to remind them of their duty, and to obey them to the extent that they're doing the duty God has given them.